Hello, everyone. Welcome to Speaker Night. My name is Lenora Henson, and I'm the Curator and Director of Public Programming here at Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural site. Speaker Night is made possible through the generous support of M&T Bank, as well as the New York State Council on the Arts. And Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesdays of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. I also, just as a quick note, if you've missed any of our earlier Speaker Night presentations, many of them are available on our YouTube channel, again, thanks to the support of the New York State Council on the Arts. This one will also be on our YouTube channel. I encourage you to check those out at your leisure. That's it. Tonight we're joined by Lisa K. Parshall, who will be looking at the role of Theodore Roosevelt and the election of 1912 in the fight to democratize the presidential nominating process. Dr. Parshall is an associate professor of political science at Damon College. She specializes in American politics, public law, and public policy. She serves as an officer for the New York State and Northeastern Political Science Associations, as well as the New York State Key Votes Advisor for Vote Smart. Dr. Parshall is also a Richard P. Nathan Public Policy Fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government in Albany, and she has a book that's due out this summer that will be titled Reforming the Presidential Nominating Process, Front-Loading's Consequences and the National Primary Solution. Which personally sounds fascinating, and I'm sure everyone will be looking forward to that. So having said that, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Dr. Parshall. Please join me in welcoming her.
Left there is the cover of Cosmopolitan, which published an article on the treason of the Senate, which led to some of the support for the passage of the 17th Amendment. And down below there is HR Resolution 39, which would become the 17th Amendment. It's in this era that states first began experimenting with presidential primaries. And the idea of presidential primaries is to, not quite as they work today, but to allow the voters to have some expression of preference as to who they would want their state's delegates at the National Nominating Convention to vote for, and or the selection of the delegates themselves. And we saw the first sort of primary law at the presidential level was Florida in 1905. But we see a spate of states, Oregon here in 1910, North Dakota. If you go on down the list, New York would add a presidential primary in 1911 with the help of TR support, New York State, Massachusetts, he was behind that as well in the push for that. So we would see states adding presidential primaries. Again, we're loosely using that word because they were not primaries in the sense today. The state laws were very complicated, and we'll talk about in a minute, very varied. Over here, I've graphed for you sort of the rise in the number of presidential primaries, and you'll see from their sporadic beginnings, they sort of uptick in the 1920s, but we start to reach the doldrums where states are repealing or getting rid of their national primaries. It's not really, or presidential primaries, it's not really until the 1968 reforms, in which starting with the Democratic Party, democratized small d, its primary selection process after the 1968 Democratic Convention. And the Republican Party was sort of swept along with this. And really to adhere to the party's new rules, more states found it easier just to pass primary laws. So we don't see the rise of modern presidential primaries. And then of course, this is the area that I really studied, is the post-68 era of now we're in a period where we have a lot of presidential primaries. But this is the origins. We started off with primaries in the early 1900s. These primaries were highly criticized at the time. One, because they did not have uniform rules at all. They varied from state to state. They were too few in number, really, to affect the nomination. The outcomes of these presidential primaries had no binding effect whatsoever on the delegates in the National Convention. They were prone to party rating, so they were not necessarily restricted to members of the party only, so non-members would sometimes come in and vote for the least electable person. By the 1920s, Congress was looking at primaries and saying that they're costly, it's a mad race, right? they have some negatives already coming out in terms of cost. Wait till they see what's coming, right? Sequence was mattered. We already were seeing that these, because the dates of the primaries were selected by the states, they were sequential, and so the lineup mattered. We'll come back to that when we look at the 1912 election. And already we saw the rise of what modern political scientists would call the divisive primary hypothesis, that a bloody nomination battle is thought to hurt that party's chances of winning the general election. And so this idea then in the early primaries is that they were criticized for a variety of reasons as being ineffective. A major sort of focusing point then for our story really is the 1912 election. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And of course, some of you are probably very familiar with the background of this story, but if we start with the Republican Party nomination, this is really an inter-party rivalry between former President Roosevelt and his chosen, in some ways, I'll use that lightly, successor, William Howard Taft. So Taft is elected after Roosevelt, with Roosevelt's blessing as the leader of the Republican Party as his chosen successor, and Roosevelt and Taft's relationship will soon quickly sour. And so there I have on the left the two palsy-wowsies there, and then cartoon depictions of the two fighting. So if we think about what split, or what, at least in part, and this is a very truncated discussion of this, but what split in Taft and Roosevelt, to understand this, you have to really understand that there was a split in both parties of Congress between the progressive and the conservative wings. And so when Taft assumes the presidency, he is going to take some actions that is going to anger the progressive wing of his party. And from the sidelines, former President Roosevelt is going to be critical and is going to come back out and challenge Taft for the nomination. So what were some of these splits? Again, some of you are probably very familiar with this if you're fans of TR in the era. Taft had abandoned the insurgents of the progressive wing of the party and their challenge to Speaker Joe Cannon in the House. Taft had shown, well, I wouldn't say support necessarily of the Payne-Aldrich bill, because he really angered both sides in the wranglings over that tariff law. But that was part of the, both sides were angry, but there was criticism that Taft didn't handle it as Roosevelt would have handled it, perhaps. A more personal rift between them is the Bollinger-Pinochet affair. This is when check his title here, just to make sure I've got it right, Secretary of the Interior Bollinger opened up public lands in the West against TR's conservation policies. And the forestry secretary or director of the Forestry Service, Pinochet, criticized this very vocally and very publicly, and Taft's response was to fire Pinochet rather than to fire Bollinger, as Pinochet had argued. And then there was the one that we're going to focus on, which is the disagreement over the adoption of these devices of direct democracy, like presidential primaries. Roosevelt, in a nutshell, was in support of direct democracy, had worked to get those presidential primary laws into effect in New York and in Massachusetts before he would challenge for the nomination. And as we'll see, Taft would, his support for it's going to be far less, for good reason. So Roosevelt is going to come back and challenge Taft for the nomination. So we have a cartoon era of the day of the two of them having a knife fight, right, rolling around, and then my favorite, they're both trying to wear the trousers of the GOP, pulling in different directions. Roosevelt is going to, in this challenge, because just quite frankly, he's much more politically popular than, popularly popular than Taft, is going to make the presidential primaries and direct democracy and direct nomination, rather, the cause of the day. And so he is going to become our champion of devices of direct democracy. One of the things that I needed to look at for my purposes is what was the scope of Roosevelt's support for presidential primaries. And there is a little bit of a mistake or a misunderstanding in a lot of contemporary literature. He did not argue for a same-day national primary. He was arguing for the adoption nationwide of presidential primaries, plural, not necessarily taking place on the same day. For Roosevelt, as one of the progressive magazines of the day that was supportive of Roosevelt said, for him, this is not just a factional fight. This is a titanic contest between the people themselves and the perpetual politicians who represent all that is worst in the corruption, right? And so Roosevelt was quoted by the New York Times as saying, I hope that as far as possible, the people are to be given a chance through direct primaries to express their preference as to who shall be the nominee of the Republican presidential convention. Taft, in contrast, has relatively anemic support for the presidential primaries, and we'll see why in a second. When in the call for the convention call for 1912 would have started at the 1908 convention set by the Republican Party convention. In 1911, as they were finalizing the call for 1912 for the convention delegates, Senator Borah, who was a progressive who was critical of Taft, but ultimately would not support Roosevelt's leaving of the party and challenge under the Progressive Party, he made a proposal for the adoption of presidential primaries. And that was defeated within the political party, Republican Party organization by the Taft men, right, to keep out of the call this demand or request for presidential primaries. As Roosevelt pushed for the primaries, Taft's campaign manager would say, well, yes, primaries are great and direct nomination is great, but you can't change the rules in the middle of the game, right? And so that's against fair play. So why Roosevelt is publicly pushing for the adoption of primaries, Taft is, his support is in name only, it's anemic. So I like this little cartoon, it's very difficult to see. It's called Nothing Fiery, and you have the young woman on the right wearing I don't know why a box exactly, I guess it's a ballot box, that says direct primaries, courting Taft, saying she's madly in love with him, and he says, I love you too, my dear, but merely in a platonic sense. So this is the states that had primaries in 1912. I have there in the column for the Republican convention, the winner between La Follette, Taft, and Roosevelt. And then I also added in, just for your own reference, what was going on in the Democratic primary. So sequence, we said sequence matters. The insurgents against Taft were hoping that he would get knocked out with North Dakota, that would deliver a blow. Didn't happen. Taft comes back to win New York. I did asterisk New York there. New York had a law in effect that said the parties could, if they wanted, have a primary. So the Democrats didn't, the Republicans did, but that New York preferential primary, was really controlled by the party elite within the New York convention. So even though the voters of New York voted, it was really the selection of delegates fell to the state party leaders. As you look down the list, you'll see that by the time we get to Illinois, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Roosevelt is picking up wins, and this is his popularity. And this explains why he wanted direct presidential preferential primaries. He was winning them. Massachusetts is interesting. I flagged them there. Taft won the popular vote, but Massachusetts was a state that split its popular vote from the selection of delegates. So even though Taft won, Roosevelt walked away with more delegates. New Jersey was also one of those split circumstances, but in that case, both the popular vote and the delegate selection went to Roosevelt. But as we leave the primaries, and Ohio is also interesting, Taft's sort of chances of winning came down in some sense, or people were saying at the time, it's going to come down to Ohio. If he can't win his home state of Ohio, he's out. So the primary in Ohio, it rivaled the general election in terms of turnout and excitement. And of course, Taft lost. But we come out of the presidential, of the presidential primaries. Now I've goofed it up entirely. We come out of the presidential primaries in 1912 with La Follette with 36 delegates going into the convention, Taft 48, and Roosevelt an impressive 278. And of course, what's happening in all the rest of the states is their delegates are being chosen in a statewide convention instead of primaries. And in most of those, the party regulars went for Taft. So how, again, how does, you have to understand that primaries weren't binding, but how does Taft win despite the show of popular support for Roosevelt and the few primaries that were there? And the answer, of course, is that the convention and the party bosses of the convention steamrolled the process. So I have up here Mark Hanna, who really controlled patronage going all the way back to the 1890s and controlled many of the delegates at the convention. The convention itself, the chairman was Elulu Root, who was a Taft man. Bora, who supported Roosevelt, would, as a progressive insurgent, again, his amendment to amend the call for more direct primaries and permissive primaries was defeated, but he will abandon Roosevelt as Roosevelt holds the party. But in a nutshell, what we see is that the convention is controlled by the party elites, and the party elites control the seating of the delegates and credentials challenges. And in those credential challenges, I didn't put the numbers up here, I apologize, I should have. In those credential challenges, Roosevelt ends up denied the delegates that he feels that he won from the primaries. One other thing that's interesting about this convention is that Roosevelt comes to the convention in Chicago. And so this electrified the crowds. And he is speaking to the crowds outside of the convention, anticipating the theft or the thievery of his nomination. I went before the people and I won. Now the National Committee and a portion of the convention, which is made majority only by the aid of delegates not elected but chosen by the National Committee, are trying to cheat me out of the nomination. They can't do it. As far as I'm concerned, it makes no difference. But it's not me they are cheating, it is the people, the rank and file of the Republican Party. If that sounds like kind of familiar, we'll come back to that. Roosevelt, again, adds to the hysteria by showing up. He would also author a piece in the Outlook magazine called Thou Shalt Not Steal. And here's where he gives his fiery 45-minute speech in June 17, 1912, talking about this battle, this titanic battle we've talked about for democracy. And this is where he says, this is a contest of a larger struggle. Excuse me, my eyesight is failing. We fight in honorable fashion for the good of mankind, fearless of the future, unheeding of our individual fates, with unflinching hearts and undimmed eyes, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. The battle is for direct democracy. Here are my numbers. The convention would culminate. We needed 1,078 delegates to win, 1,078 delegates total, 540 to win the nomination. There were 254 contested seats. 235 of those were decided by the chairpersons of the Credentials Committee in favor of Taft. 19 decided for Roosevelt. Taft would win the roll call vote at the convention with a majority and a nomination with only 21 votes to spare. Lewis Gold, one of my favorite historians at the time, said the convention wasn't Armageddon, but it was a close second. Right. A raucous convention made more tumultuous by the outcome. That's what the Coliseum in Chicago looked like as the delegates met. It looked sort of orderly there, but and of course, as the result of what he deemed thievery, Roosevelt will bolt the party in June of 1912. This was a key moment. So what I found in my research for my purposes is, yes, this is absolutely a key moment in the history of the national primary, but we have to qualify it in saying that Roosevelt was not arguing for a same-day primary, but rather multiple primaries, plural. And his advocacy was self-serving. It was a reference to scope, but it did not include the simultaneity in scheduling of state contests, which some people mistakenly look back today and say, well, he was an advocate for a national primary. Asterisk that. Here's a picture of Taft and Wilson accepting their party's nominations. This was, of course, common in the day. Roosevelt being at the convention was uncommon. It was the common practice for nominees to accept the nomination elsewhere. On their front porches, I guess. Of course, the results, and this is the start of the divisive primary hypothesis, the result of the split in the Republican nomination would benefit Wilson in the general election. So Wilson will win with 45% of the vote. Roosevelt and Taft split the rest, and there's the mighty hunter with both the bull moose and the elephant on his wall. Wilson will still quite a few of the progressive ideas that came out, truthfully, out of the Republican progressive faction in Congress. And so a lot of progressive reforms Wilson would advocate for. The one, again, that I'm most interested in is the national primary. So in 1913, Wilson would give an address to Congress in which he urged the prompt enactment of legislation that would provide for primary elections throughout the country at which the voters of the several parties may choose their nominees without the intervention of nominating conventions. So he made this address to Congress. The understanding at the time in the common practice then was not to attribute things directly to the president, but the New York Times would report that the president wanted these primaries to be on the same day. The problem was getting Congress to agree, and the problem was the practicalities that still confront us for presidential primary reformers and presidential nominating reform today, is that the states control the setting of the dates, the states control a lot of the process of the selection and the primaries. And so the president met with some members of Congress and was discouraged very quickly. He wanted a same-day primary, but he was told the problem is that there's no day that would be acceptable to all the states. And we may not have the constitutional authority. Congress said for us to do this by law, we would have to amend the U.S. Constitution. Another problem is that, as we said, these primaries were so diverse in their details that we're not sure that we can get anything that's uniform, even if we get it in simultaneity and scope, national and scope, that we can get it so that it's the same rules, so that it would be restricted to members only. So I did go through Wilson's correspondence. There were some references where somebody wrote him and said, hey, what happened in national primaries? And he said, of course, I've never forgotten it. It was on his list of agenda items. But it seems to have dropped off. He got no encouragement from his advisor, Colonel House. He got no encouragement from the leadership in Congress. And then, of course, other issues would come to capture Wilson's attention. And so the national primary fades out. So Wilson did, yes, propose a same-day national primary. There was very little action on it. That led me to turn to looking at what was going on in Congress. And so, again, there's an argument against the national primary, the adoption of it today, that says, well, Congress has looked at this and Congress has rejected it. So I never believed that. I wanted to see for myself, is that true? So I went back and I looked through all of the reform proposals for changing the presidential nominating system that have gone through Congress. There were about 322 in total. I found that about 173 of those we could call a national primary, broadly defined. But 26% of those 173 were not actually for simultaneous same-day primary. We do know that 86% of them called for a constitutional amendment, which said that Congress's consensus is we can't do this through ordinary legislation, we would have to amend the Constitution. But when I looked for bills and their details that actually had a national primary that was national in scope, all states, same day, and had uniform rules of participation as to who could take part, I actually found that only about 20% of proposals ever to come through Congress are for what I would consider a true national primary. There's no discernible regional pattern in terms of who's offering these or geographic pattern. It's really about 15 legislators who are offering the proposals over and over again. Most of them aren't giving hearing. I have over here, in case you're interested, sort of the content analysis that I did of each of the bills, the questions that I looked at. I think only 3 of them ever saw floor action, and they were proposed as floor amendments and were defeated in the Senate very quickly. When you graph out the rate at which presidential primary proposals have come through Congress, what we see is sort of 3 waves. A little wave, if I did it again. Wrong button. A little wave after 1912, bigger waves after the tumultuous nominations in 1952 and 1968. So we see sort of peaks of congressional proposals that come after messy nominating fights, right? It reminds me when I was looking at electoral college reform, because I looked at that too, because often electoral college reform and primary reform are paired together. And I forget which senator it was, but I thought it was very astute. He said, this type of reform is like fixing a hole in your roof, right? When it's the sun is shining, you don't think about it, and then by the time it's raining again, it's just too late. The other thing with national primary proposals is that starting in 1972 with the first proposal introduced by Senator Bob Packwood, is that they've just lost ground now to this idea of, well, let's not have them all on the same day, but let's do regional rotating plans that divide the states. And there's a whole series of these plans. Some divide by time zones, some are geographical pods that are would have the candidates going from one region of the country to the other. Some are interregional primaries. There's several clever plans out there. Scientists from NASA came up with sort of a reverse backloading plan. So there's a variety of them out there, and they have overtaken, as you can see. National primary proposals are the black line, and the smaller gray line is regional rotating plans. But we haven't had a national primary proposal really in Congress since 1995. And so one of my arguments in the book as to the national primary is that the logic of the national primary is exactly the same as it was in 1912. Right? But the reasons why we might want to think about a national primary are way stronger than they are now. So since it was first proposed and last proposed, things have changed. So what has changed? Well, one, we've had these nominating reforms in 1968 that democratized, again, small d, the nominating process. The Democrats started this process, but the Republicans have been swept along. We'll talk about 2016 in a minute. We've had since a voting rights revolution in the Supreme Court in the 1960s, demanding one person, one vote. So I look at 14th Amendment, First Amendment, equality rights of why should some people's voice and vote count more than others in the presidential nominating process. Unlike in 1912, the number of states holding primaries has increased. So now we do have a critical mass of states that choose their delegates to the convention through primaries, and those primaries are now binding on the outcome. Iowa and New Hampshire have enjoyed a chokehold for a long time, but that's starting to slip a little bit. South Carolina and Nevada were added to the lineup of early states. In this last election, if people were paying attention at all, Iowa canceled its straw poll because the candidates were down in Georgia at fundraisers. And so some people say, well, Iowa and New Hampshire, they're getting challenges as in 2008 from Florida and Michigan and other states. I don't see Iowa and New Hampshire going anywhere anytime soon, but they may be slipping a little bit in their hold on the first and early contest. And we've seen the acceleration of front-loading. Some have argued we're moving towards a de facto national primary in which more than 50% of the delegates are chosen on a single date. That happened in 2008 and again in 2016, although 2008 was the biggest and earliest pileup of states we've ever seen. And the national parties have been coordinating now since about 2000 to try to set the timing rules so that their contest windows open and close around the same time period. And so that they are trying to adopt timing and delegate selection rules that control the states and get the states they're trying to get them to spread out rather than gang up and front load in this kind of de facto primary. But the parties are coordinating to the extent that they haven't. So relevance to today, and where are we today? Even as I started writing this book with my co-author who since passed away, in the early 2004-2008 period, as we moved into 2016, things had sort of changed a little bit. And it makes me wonder whether, in some ways, this battle for direct democracy and direct nominations is in fact over. So if we look at what happened in 2016 in the GOP race, I know I picked a good picture, didn't I? Trump, of course, asserted a claim to the nomination based on the fact that he was leading in the delegate count, but even before he had clinched a mathematical majority of the delegates, he was talking about being cheated out of the nomination and attempts to steal the nomination. In fact, some of his language is very close to Roosevelt, right? And they can't do it. They're trying to cheat me out of this. The RNC did push back a little as this was happening, trying a little bit educating voters that, well, no, technically you have to have a majority. And if you come into the convention without a majority, you're not entitled to the nomination. And they secured a pledge from all of the nominees that would say, you'll support the winner of the nomination. Trump was the last person to sign the pledge. Priebus had to chase him down to get him to sign it. But when the Trump creeped closer to getting that mathematical majority, and there was the Never Trump movement that would turn into the Don't Trump at the convention movement, the RNC really didn't push back very hard. And of course, at the convention itself, when Trump won Indiana in May and had the mathematical majority, the lingering resistance of the Never and Don't Trump movements was effectively quashed at the convention. And that was done with the full support and coordination of the RNC and RNC leadership. In other words, the GOP embraced Trump as the nominee at the convention, and they have embraced him now as the leader of their party. And so with that, I think the Republicans have ceded that it is up to the rank and file to pick the party's nominee. Even though if you look at it, Trump was certainly not predicted by party leaders or political scientists to win. In some ways, his candidacy was treated almost as a joke by the party elite. He was not the choice of the party elite. Jeb Bush was the leader in both endorsements and money raise. But the party did accept him as the nominee and accepted the idea that it is the voters who should be choosing the party's nominee. The Democrats had been there a little earlier, and they had their own issues in 2016. Superdelegates, these unelected, or not unelected, but unpledged, rather, party leaders and elected officials who are not bound by any primary result. This is a category that was added in 1984, I believe, as sort of a mediating effect of party elite on the nomination. And in 2008, when we saw the close contest between Obama and Clinton, it looked like the superdelegates would decide the race. And in fact, the superdelegates in some ways did decide the nomination in 2008. But that was believed to be undemocratic. And so in 2016, we were looking at the same thing as Sanders is challenging Clinton, the idea, well, maybe this will come down to the choice of the superdelegates, and that is undemocratic. And of course, Bernie was a little bit of a hypocrite in the sense that he said those superdelegates are undemocratic. They shouldn't be there, until it became clear he couldn't win the nomination without them, and then he put all his effort into flipping them, right? And then we had, in the Democratic process, we had claims that the process was rigged. So the Sanders folks tussled with the DNC numerous times, saying that the DNC had its thumb on the scale in favor of Hillary Clinton. That would be magnified by Donna Brazil's book, the leaked emails, the hacked emails, that caused frisson. It's the same story, sort of the party is accepting that it should be the voters and that the party leaders should be neutral in the nomination contest. And so this has really set up, in some ways, I think, an acceptance of the idea that Roosevelt was championing, which is a democratic norm. And that's sort of, have we now embraced the notion that it is the right of the people to decide the nomination without the intervention and mediation of the convention? And if that's true, this is sort of my argument in the book, if that's where we are, then there's no justification for retaining a sequential front-loaded sequence that leaves some voters with less voice than others. for our purposes tonight, I thought, what we might want to think about together is whether the achievement of that democratic norm, that it is the right of the rank and file, maybe we want to rethink that. Maybe Roosevelt might want to rethink that, would rethink that, right? Has this norm now that the voters choose the nominee, has winning this battle for the Democratic nominations, has it saved democracy or has it imperiled it? Is there an argument that we do need party leaders at the convention to impose a mediating voice on who we select? Because running for office and the ability to win elections is quite different from the ability to govern and govern effectively. And if the party is there to sort of protect its brand, then we could argue they have an obligation not just to nominate people who can win, but people who can effectively govern once they have. Thank you.